But first of all, I just wanted to say thanks for joining. Thanks for coming to have this conversation, and a special thanks, to all the sponsors and everyone that really invited me here. This particular talk has evolved in a lot of different ways, and it really has changed the way that I think about identity and the way that I think about collective identity in a really new way, because I had actually started this particular exercise really trying to get to know myself. So as I looked out into what makes up Colleen T. Reese, I was noticing that so much about the way that I expressed identity or formed identity when it had to do with myself was a lot to do with like work or things that were really external to me. And in the past year, I tried to think about whether or not that was a true sense of identity. And I learned a lot of really cool things about myself. And so I originally started this a little bit after I attended a conference called ELEConf, if you're familiar. Yeah, ELEConf, they're really cool. And I had this really unique interaction with somebody that I really consider to be a critical moment of my life. Prior to that conference and that conversation, I was always looking for ways to kind of belong. My whole life, I was really attracted to alternative culture. I really felt differently than I think a lot of my peers, or I had a perception of feeling differently. And as I grew up and I moved into fields where collective and craft were really celebrated as a community, I was like, okay, well, where do I fit in terms of like a content strategy community? Where do I fit in terms of a creative community or a technology community? And it really started a conversation with myself and a conversation, I think, with a collective of people about what is collective identity versus, almost like the infinite possibility of identity. And so here's like a quick, fun introduction to me. I'm a content strategist. That's my craft. It's what I love to do. I'm a sentence case advocate. I don't know what it is, but like if I see title case in just like a regular website, I'm like, why? It feels very self-important, like to title case a headline in a website. And it's so funny, like I fight with so many of my clients on this. I'm like, why is it title case though? And they're like, well, because it's the title. And I'm like, who cares? I'm an AP style loyalist. I'm a former writer and almost journalist. And so I tend to kind of stick with that when I write my brand guides. I'm like, we'll stick to AP. And then really I'm actually loyal to nothing. So if I'm writing a brand guide and I decide that we're actually going to write out every number and I don't care if it's over or under 12, I have no loyalty to any style guide. I'm a fat geek girl. I love video games. I love my body. I have no shame. I'm not afraid of it. And these two are actually kind of connected. So does anybody here play like RPG games or like, yeah? Nice. So I really relate to like the Guild of Builder. And if you're not familiar with how these games go, like at the beginning of the game, they're like, you get to select a guild or like a race or a class. And it's like elf, thief, like warrior. And I really relate to builders because builders have like super high health. They have a very strong foundation. Like it's very hard to knock them over. And they like also get to wield like super sick weapons that like not other characters can like hold because they're not like big and strong enough. And this was a way for me to like translate maybe what I was like feeling insecure about my body into something that like I loved doing. Like there's a really specific and fun class for me and I get to yield like awesome weapons. I love trashy Twitter posts. I love them. Like if you write trashy Twitter posts, I will follow you, I will retweet you, I will love them. And then these are some that like people use to describe me. So like I get like tough broad a lot. Like people are like, I can like endure a lot. I'm very candid and I'm a little rough around the edges. Definitely a square peg. I love being a contrarian. I love being somebody who is not afraid to kind of step outside and try something different. I'm also just a secret softie. I'm a sentimentalist at heart, and so These are really like a short excerpt of like what my identity looks like. So for me, when I started really kind of moving into a really highly visible role in content strategy, and I was presenting to clients a lot, I was interviewing at jobs, this is like the culmination of like all of my insecurity about the community. You know, like I didn't see myself in this photo at all. And often when we're looking at like advertisements or content that's around like people who are creative or people who are like create content, like this is their workspace. And I don't see myself in that. And that's not to say that there's anything wrong with identifying with this. I think there's something really admirable about identifying with this. But like, here's where I fit in. Like, and like what, where does that, where do we put that in terms of like the content community or the technology community? And so I started asking people to share their stories with me about how their physical identity, or even how their like imperceptible identity, your intangibles, how they affect you at work and your identity as a content strategist. And the more that I kind of studied those stories, the more that I realized that the idea of collective community is really messy, and that was something that I never had to kind of confront before. So here's the second question that I started asking myself. Rather than who am I or who is a content strategist, I started asking myself, do shared interests or experiences equate to a shared identity? So we think about shared experiences and shared identities a lot as content strategists. You know, when somebody asks you to think about a target audience or a target user, you start to define that user and you say, okay, maybe they have this job title, maybe they are a part of this community, maybe they have experienced X, Y, and Z. And we start grouping them into these kind of shared experiences. And the more that I thought about that, I was like, well, I don't really know, because I don't fit into that, and I don't think that identity is a finite perception. It's not a finite concept. And so how can we as content strategists build spaces around something that's not necessarily finite? It's a big question, and I don't have the solution. So that's not it. So let's play pretend really quickly. I imagine that everyone here has kind of walked into a project, a new client, and they come to you and they say, okay, here's our target audience. Here's different segments of that audience. Let's say one subsect of their audience needs this particular product or service, and another needs that. And they'll give you basic information about who those people are. Demographics, their age, their gender perhaps. Or if it's like B2B, they'll explain to you like what the business is like, you know, what job titles or primary functions they're looking for. And sometimes that audience is current state, and sometimes it's aspirational. And you as a content strategist are kind of like, yep, totally got it. And you're going to start to translate those things into user needs. You're going to start to translate those characteristics into content. But let's say this client is a cafe owner. And maybe they're like across the street, they're like La Colombe. They're trying to come up with a repeatable product. And let's say that that product is iced coffee. So you start thinking about all the different people that like iced coffee, the characteristics about them, and you start grouping them into things. And you usually come up with something that looks a little bit like this. So this is like your typical persona, right? This is a common denominator. Yes, this is a common denominator of an audience. So we're going to say like, okay, our target demographic is 25 to 45. They're probably female. They have their occupation as a young professional. It would probably be more specific than this. And then maybe if you got creative, you would like build a daily life. You'd talk about like what they do when they get up. But real quick, I just want everyone that this applies to stand up really quickly. Like if this, and I'm sorry I am picking on women because I looked at the attendee list. Right? What? Oh. Actually, if anyone is feeling like particularly excited, you can walk to the front right now, and I'd love for you to stand in a line. If you want, you don't have to. Okay. You don't have to. You don't have to if you don't want to. Right? This is going to be a very tactile exercise. Okay. So this is what you give to your client. This is the reality. But you don't give your client 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Are you standing? 8? 8 personas for who likes to drink iced coffee. You can sit down now. The point is, if we take a look at their physical space, and we're just building contextual clues now. Everyone has their own outfit on. They might have their hair fashioned differently. They have different heights. And so when we start to think about this, we're like, okay, well, what does this really do then? Like, what is this really telling us about our target audience, and how are we going to use it to inform all of our content decisions? You know, the persona is definitely under a lot of scrutiny right now. Like, what do we use it for, and what is its function? And I think its original function is really nice. I get the underlying value of a persona, which is like, there has to be commonalities between people. And that's how we start to understand, you know, identity about one another. And I share this anecdote a lot. So thinking about commonality as a way to explain identity is kind of bizarre. So I was reading this essay once, and it was about like strange things that specifically like North Americans do that like the rest of the world finds really bizarre and almost rude. And one of those things is like, when we get to know each other, one of the first things that we ask one another is like, what do you do? What's your job? Right? Like if you were at a party and you like met someone new, you'd be like, hey, what's your name? What do you do? And that seems very normal to us because we're trying to like seek out something that we perhaps have in common or understand about one another. But the essay went on basically to say like, and I really can't find it again. The essay went on to say like, a lot of people think that that's a really strange behavior because what is a conversation but an exchange of information? Like, it's very selfish for us to ask a question hoping to find something in common. Like, it's very strange. It's kind of a strange way to get to know somebody. You're basically saying like, I want to know information about you totally on my terms. And that's what we do so often as content strategists or even brand strategists. We say, we kind of want to validate some of these assumptions that we have, and we're going to seek out ways that you fit this mold, rather than saying like, give me an exchange of information so that I can learn from you. So, and I think that comes from this kind of prevailing wisdom of content strategy, which is like, right people plus right content equals success, right? And I think that I've always been really suspicious of this phrase for 2 reasons. One, I think that it builds this idea that there's such thing as like a wrong person, which I think is really strange. Like, if you were standing in like a stadium full of people, which is basically what the internet is, you're reaching thousands of people, and you say like, wrong, 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 like they're already there. They already showed up. They are right. I also think that like all personas, who works in consumer and who works in B2B? Consumer? B2B, right? How often do so many of your right people or your personas lead to either millennial mom or C-suite? Right? And it's because like they'll say like, oh, this is our aspiration. No more millennial moms. She doesn't exist. She doesn't exist. The way that they describe her is like, it's just not a real person. So like, how many like millennial moms exist? And how many of them can you group into a category and say, these people have tons in common. They behave exactly the same. They never do anything differently from one another. It's so rare. So let's go back to right people plus right content and evaluate right content. So there's another reason that I'm really suspicious of right people, right content equals success. And that's because right content trains content strategists to fill in gaps, to fill in stuff. So when you do a content audit or a gap analysis, you're saying like, okay, here's a spot for content, here's a spot for content, here's a spot for content, and now I'm gonna fill them in, right? If you are working on a website, maybe there's a design done, somebody hands you a design comp, a prototype, and they say, here's a block for content, here's another block for content. I need you to fill that with words, which is like turning content strategy into essentially advertising copy, right? This is kind of negating what we do as content strategists. But content can't be a block, and content strategy can't be fit within a block. And so that's something that, you know, I always try to think about. Phew. Sorry, I thought I would have a podium and that this would be like way more natural. And it also creates this sense that content is like a swap for swap exchange. So like if you put the right content, you're going to immediately get an exchange of value and not necessarily an exchange of information. So if I give this person content, they're going to give me, you know, their content information. They'll subscribe to a newsletter or something like that. So let's do the time warp again. So before I got here, you guys were all kind of like mixing and mingling and getting to know one another. And you probably asked each other questions like, what is your name and what do you do? Maybe a little bit more specifically because we share a community, we share a collective identity. So what I want us to do is spend about 10 minutes together, and you can self-organize into groups of like 2 or 3. You can even stay with yourself if you want to get to know yourself. That's a perfectly appropriate action to do in the next 10 minutes. I did it for like 6 months. So I want you to spend about 10 or 15 minutes with your pen and paper, and I want you to ask each other questions that can't be answered with like, what do you do? And start asking people questions about who they are. So like, what do you do in the morning when maybe you're stressed out? Like, how do you respond to peer pressure? How do you, that was not what I thought was gonna go down. We're adults. Pressure in general. And try to get to know one another in a deeper way. And then we're going to talk about how to change the process of like, what is a persona to how can we have conversations that yield insights about identity. So try not to ask like questions that are categorical, like, are you a parent? You can say like, do you enjoy having children? And yes or no is kind of like, okay. So self-organize, find 2 people that you want to get to know. And we're going to build personas around anything. So that was really cool. I hope that you guys, I feel like I made a friend, which was really neat. I did too. But I'd love for you guys, if anybody's feeling up to it, to talk about how different a conversation like the one you just had feels like than your traditional kind of structured persona script. So like the scripts you write to learn about users or to learn about personas, and maybe some highlights from your conversations, questions that you haven't thought to ask somebody that might help you understand them better. So does anybody want to volunteer? Okay.
So I asked, what have you been thinking about lately?
Cool.
And it launched an entire discussion about determinism. And like what is in our control, what isn't in our control, and
okay.
Like all these directions that sort of like help me understand how each of the people in our group think about these things.
Okay.
And how much control, what they like or don't like about feeling like they have control, or whether or not they don't have control, and how that makes them feel, and how they react to that.
Mm-hmm.
But it was way more interesting than, what do you do?
So do you feel like understanding something that's like maybe a little bit specific or tangential, like determinism, or evaluating like control, which is very philosophical, do you feel like you could understand or communicate something that's like real world characteristics or traits about the people that you were speaking to?
I feel like for me, I'd be trying to use that information to understand if they are coming to my website or whatever, I now know, is it important for me to understand how much control they feel like they have in that experience, right?
Cool.
And if I'm able to say, okay, it sounds like having control is a high priority, I'm going to use language and interactions and visual design that always make you feel like you're in control.
Mm-hmm. Okay, last question, then I'd love to hear from somebody else. Would you ever ask in a user interview, like, how do you feel about the concept or construct of control?
I was just thinking about that. Like, I would love to sort of have the leeway, maybe in the last 5 minutes of an IDI, to sort of say, so what do you think about lately? What books have you been reading?
Yeah.
Like to just sort of try to find out, is there any like little extra, information that I can't get from like, how do you find out your banking information?
Yeah. Which are still really critical and like crucial pieces of information to have when you're building a profile around a user. But so much goes into the answer that they give you. Being able to give somebody the freedom to just say like, hey, how or what do you often think about, can help you inform like what's the contextual meaning to their response to where do you get your banking information from. Cool.
Well, Maurice came up with a question that I think, we actually didn't get time to discuss it. He crossed it out, but it said, do you like the morning or not?
Oh.
And I'm thinking on your coffee example, like.
I hate the mornings.
But doesn't that really affect how that person's going to deal with how they're going to choose coffee? I mean, of course, if they're happy that the coffee's going to wake them up, I guess.
Right? So when I was thinking about, and then I'd love to hear from you. When I was thinking about the coffee example, I was actually like thinking in my head, because it's something that I do every day, and I very specifically stop to get coffee. I don't make coffee at home, and I don't get it at the office. It's like a stop in my day, and I was like, why do I do that? Like, why is it important for me to stop? And I like found myself answering really philosophically. And I was responding to like childhood ideas of like what a writer would look like and do like, and you think that you grow out of those things, but like I stop for coffee because it makes me feel like I have succeeded in my childhood dream of being like financially stable enough to like buy my coffee every day. Like that's a real validation that I give to myself every day. I also just like kind of feeling like a boss, and so I do that for myself every day. So what made you think of that question?
Well, I don't know. It was early on in trying to sort of think of the questions that we were going to ask, and I'm like, how do I want to approach it? I mean, is this a sort of a yes or no? Is this going to be something a little broader or whatever? And I think I missed the boat to be the first person to sort of ask a question. So I'm like, it doesn't sound like we're going in that direction with a yes or no. It seems more interesting to go in a different direction. I'll just cross this off.
Okay.
Crazy thing is, we started with another question, which was,
what do you daydream about?
What do you?
Which beautiful question, and in the sort of circle of trying to answer that question, it came up.
I said I daydream about being a morning person.
Oh my God, me too.
So that's where that sort of cycled back in. But that whole question spawned a lot of discussion around things that either were things that we wished about ourselves, maybe things that, in my case, my answer was, I think, a little bit half fear-driven, half sort of aspirational. And it was an interesting sort of round conversation that brought out things about what we value.
Fears and goals. Yeah.
Right. In a way that I don't think, like asking specifically, like, would you like to be financially stable? And you're like, well, of course I would. Versus, I daydream about money,
Mm-hmm.
Which is what I said. Anyway.
Hey, it's an appropriate answer.
Which is actually sort of different.
Mm-hmm.
Sort of, but halfway fear-driven. So. But yeah, and it was interesting to sort of go around the circle and discover things about what we value through a simple question about what you think. I guess it's also what you think about question in a weird way, right? It's just that vague, but actionable in similar ways, right? You know, aspiring to be a morning person means, you know, we can do things to sort of push to that,
Right,
like
right.
push to that aspiration.
Right, it would, a quality of life aspiration.
Right.
Very cool.
It was neat.
Nice. Any other highlights or questions that you asked each other?
How about the question you need to ask? No. There was a things you hate question.
Ooh.
We didn't get to ask. We didn't get to answer the most extreme thing question. I thought that was going to be awesome, but
It was, what's the most extreme thing you've done to achieve something you've wanted?
Ooh.
which just
That's a great question.
Yeah, it sounds like a fantastic question.
That's fantastic.
Hopefully it's not murder.
Yeah, I would. I would really hope.
Big screen.
Cool. Anyone else? Next up. All right, cool. I also do this exercise, I think, because it often illustrates what I think is super special and exciting about content strategists. So how many of you come from like traditionally editorial backgrounds? You're writers, right? Maybe academics. How many of you come from like more of a design or technology background? Okay. Really, the thing that most of content strategists have in common, whether they come from a traditionally editorial background or something that's maybe a little bit more design and developed oriented, is that they serve, understand, and are extremely curious about people, right? This is this idea, and the reason that skills like empathy skills are so hot. You know, thinking about how do we understand people? How do we care for people in the digital spaces that we create? And I think content strategists have this inclination to ask really interesting questions. And where we've kind of started to put ourselves astray is that we've almost taken the serendipity out of conversation. So when we set up things like user interviews, there's a really finite quantitative goal to say, okay, we need to determine the percentage priority of this particular user need versus this one, or this audience target versus the other. And when we remove like the intangibles and the almost like philosophical questions we're asking each other, the natural flow of conversation is interrupted. And how do you get to know somebody? You don't like start taking notes on them. Like if we were at a party or like a gathering and we wanted to get to know each other, the way we just were, really, we would ask each other questions that exceed, you know, what is your name? What is your job? Because that's just naturally how you get to know somebody. So why don't our personas and our user journeys allow for some intangibility, allow for some serendipity in how we understand people? Because when we think about like collective identity, like we're all content strategists. If somebody built a persona around us, like everyone in this room, they would miss so many unique and different things about ways to interact with all of the people in this room. You know, because they're gonna say like, they're content strategists, they live in Philadelphia or the Philadelphia surrounding area, they go to meetups, right? That's what we do. Like, you could build a persona off of us really quickly, but we have really interesting other ways that we want to communicate with us. So, are you a writer? Did you come from a writing background? And that has like its whole own set of like personality traits and characteristics. And so we have to start thinking about how can we allow space in content strategy to develop a more multidimensional and dynamic sense of identity, because it's not finite and it's not going to stay the same. Like you don't do your personas, and I mean, it's project-based work, so like, yeah, you do your personas and then you move on. But like once you do them, like think about yourself a year ago, 6 months ago, 9 months ago. You've changed. So your persona is always going to change. So we have to think about ways to reorient the conversation in content strategy, less about defining identity or defining persona, and instead create spaces that allow for the flexibility and fluidity of continued understanding of identity. So I'm going to share a little quote with you because Creed Bratton is like my hero. And I'm sorry if this is a spoiler for anybody, but in the very last episode of The Office, he says, no matter how you get there or where you end up, human beings have this miraculous gift to make that place home. So he's talking about a specific place, obviously, and a group of people. So his persona would be like office worker, right? And when we think about that and how it equates to like how we build digital spaces or how we employ content strategy to build digital spaces, the idea that you have to give the right content to the right people is almost irrelevant. Like, people are going to associate meaning to the things that you create because they miraculously can. And so your job as a content strategist is to build a space that somebody can use kind of on their own terms, based on their identity. And so I really love to think about Creed in The Office for content strategy, and that's his beautiful noggin. So yeah, our job is not to define identity. So you can also inform systems that provide meaning. So you're not necessarily building a space. Maybe you're in the discipline of content strategy that does more with information architecture. Again, you're still not saying like, okay, this is our target audience, here's the things that they believe. You're building a system that allows them to employ those pieces of themselves in relation to your space. So the title of this was, Can Content Strategy Change the Way That We Think About Identity? And this slide is a question to you. So do you think that as a content strategist, you can change the way that we, as a community of content professionals, or we as the great people, do you think that we have the ability to change identity in the way that we think about it? And I'm asking you that question, and you can answer it now, if you want.
Like allow?
Yeah, totally allow.
The first thing that comes to mind for me is something that I also learned at LConf.
So great.
How to talk about inclusive design, and it's something that I've thought about a lot in developing personas and then in translating that into a digital environment. I'm thinking specifically about like if I were creating a form and wanting to ask someone's gender. And putting male, female, other, and those are your options. Like, I'm pretty sure someone who doesn't fall on the gender binary would consider themselves to be other. So I think in terms of like selecting the microcopy for that, or even fighting with convincing the UX designer to deliver more than 3 options, or even a fill in the blank for everybody. I think that's a way that content strategy can change the way we as practitioners think about identity, but also possibly someone who's using the platform might say like, oh, this affirms my identity, or I didn't, like, why would it fill in the blank, or why would there be more than 2 options? I didn't think that was a thing. So when it comes to like inclusive design and gender identity, I think that is a really interesting option.
Absolutely. I know exactly the talk that you were referring to, and it was really an eye-opener for me because I create personas and I develop user profiles all the time, and I was like, well, when was the last time I created a user profile for a trans person, And I was like, oh my God, like I'm trans inclusive, like I would say that, I would advocate for that, and being shown an opportunity to do that was really illuminating for me as well. And that's something else that I think is often overlooked when we think about like inclusion and diversity, it's often done like in design, you know? And if we're building cultures where inclusion and diversity and that sensitivity is considered, it absolutely needs to be at content strategy, which is kind of first in line. You know, we're really at the forefront of like, how do we respond to people? How do we serve people? And so you can't just put the onus on the designer to say, hey, go and find this photo. You know, what has that done for us? We have to think about, you know, how can the use of that photo change? How can the use of microcopy like that change an experience, and how people perceive both themselves and the identity of the space that you're creating?
I think for me, one thing that this has made me think about, like when I see this, I'm automatically thinking about forms and copy that's on the page. But I think from this exercise we did, it's like before we even get there, what are all the practices and processes that we're saying that we're actually user first? So in practitioner, like every company loves to say that, but when you're asked to just like create anything very quickly, the time that's spent on research goes to zero.
Yep.
Like I literally got finished working on something where there's this new pitch for a product direction, and the slide that says end user starts with bullet number 1, question marks. Bullet number 2, what do they want? Bullet number 3, we don't know. Bullet number 4, life, liberty, maybe the pursuit of happiness. And I was like, so you want me to jump into figuring out what headlines should be, but you don't know this? Like that's scary, because there's so many products out here there's question marks, or their user is everyone.
Yep.
And so that's
Yep.
why we see bias and not even design, but content, products, processes, and everything, because a lot of times people design from their own contextual model.
Absolutely.
And who they are.
Yep.
I think, like, as content strategists, we actually have to be the advocates for, like, the communities that we're creating content for.
Yeah.
And that may mean you need to go to, like, you're creating content for transgender, you need to go to those communities and, like, actually be a part of them.
Yep.
Which is the step that many people don't do. You just Google and you're like, well, whatever the first 10 things say, that's the persona.
Yep.
So I think, you know, like we have to push ourselves to do that actual research, and you have to push yourself to get people who want to create content really quickly to do that research too.
Yeah,
You
and
know?
I'm just going to respond to that, and I definitely want to hear you. I think everyone is like a tear of joy right now. Yes, absolutely. I feel like one of the other things that, besides having so many of the same considerations that UX professionals and content professionals often struggle with, is like when it comes down to like we're negotiating dollars for services, and they're negotiating like $1,000 to $5,000 in like a $2.5 million project, right? First thing that's going to go, user research, content strategy, prototyping, and accessibility. Those are the first things that they're going to say, well, you should just do them by default. And there is no shortcut to that. And my response is often like, okay, you can restructure your pricing model to say like, okay, if you eliminate these line items, if you say like, we're not going to go through user interviews, the response from like a financial sense, like we can say, okay, well then we're elongating the timeline of your wireframe because there is no version of this product where we don't go through that. Secondly, you can be prepared as an organization. Like if you are advocating, you're saying like content strategy is going to take up this mantle and we're going to advocate for users, and you're willing to take that hit. We spent 10 minutes here together and we walked away knowing each other, right? So can you spend 10 minutes with 5 people? Can you spend an hour of your agency or firm's time to get to know the people that you're going to serve? 10 minutes. That's all it took you to like deeply understand how someone feels about like the construct of control. Like the cool thing about being a content strategist is like you have this weird permission to just ask people questions. You're just in this environment where like you're just allowed to ask them whatever you want to like normal extents. But like it's a construct where like that's allowed, and so make the most of your questions and definitely advocate. You got it.
I don't know. I've been out thinking myself of this question, but or thinking myself out of this question.
Don't. I had a paper in my hand like most of this presentation,
no.
so think yourself out of nothing.
Oh, like, I guess I was just thinking about like the practical application of it, like, because I mean, to me, like the way that current persona models are, like they're pretty useful. Like, what would that coffee persona change to if you were to adapt this stuff?
Yeah. So one of the ways that you can balance the utility of personas, which I think still has a lot of value and utility. Like a persona, to me, its greatest value is the humanization of intent. So like when I look at a persona, I'm not necessarily looking for data. I'm almost looking to have like a palate cleanser. So when I'm creating content, I'll look at a persona and I say like, okay, do these things match enough? But a persona is really the first step in user need. So when I create a persona, the next thing I'm going to do is pull out all of the user needs from each of the personas that I've created, and then I completely disassociate them from the persona. So they get put into a spreadsheet that says user need, user need, user need, user need. And we assign tasks and content to that, right? To change the way that you think about personas is really just reorienting, is it an end product or is it the start of a foundation? And so practically and in application, I would encourage you to think about the persona as a first step to building a user profile. Because there are more user profiles than there are going to be personas.
Can you elaborate on the differences between, so what are the attributes that you feel is a persona compared to a user profile?
So a user profile is based specifically in its interaction with your website or experience, and not necessarily with how that person operates in life at large. So it's a more specific iteration of what your personas are. And as we see, personas are really cohorts. They're cohorts. Like it's like, what category do these people share in common? And in order to understand like the total possible scenario for which somebody is going to use an experience or use a website, you have to keep breaking that down and specific to the website or experience. So a user profile has to do with like, how does the persona trait of I hate mornings equate to an interaction online that says I need to know what's on your coffee menu? Any other questions or ideas about how we might change the way we think or influence identity?
So I would go further than can content strategy. I would say it must, because I think that something, $20 bet. I'll pay out if I'm wrong, but give it 5-10 years.
Everyone take that bet.
Wait, is there interest on the bet? Does it exponentially? Is there a rate of inflation? Like,
we as content strategists will be tasked with feeding the AIs.
absolutely.
And part of that is going to be a lot of taxonomy work. Part of that is going to be, hey, Google, I want you to be able to identify occupations of people in photos. When you do it now, you look at a photo of a woman and you say homemaker. Why are you doing that? Because of the content you were fed to make those decisions, because make no mistake, the way we're training the AIs is with content, and aren't we supposed to know something about content? So someone, maybe not at Google, but someone is going to start to put 2 and 2 together and say, hey, maybe content strategists should be the ones figuring out how to train AIs. And not for nothing, Facebook has about 150 to 200 content strategists, and they're hiring more. I'm not saying that's what they're going to do with them, but they got the data, right? So we collectively need to get our shit together around what do we want the AI to treat people like, and how are we going to think about content in a way that makes it easier for the AI to be like, oh, that's a person.
Mm-hmm.
I can't just assume this about them based on that.
Yeah.
And again, it's a dumb machine. It's going to do what we tell it to do. Mm-hmm. And the way we're going to be communicating it with it is through taxonomy and through content. So I think we have a moral obligation to have content strategy change the way we think about identity.
Yeah, I mean the ramifications of that are enormous. Like what we feed into an AI, like, is damn near political. You know, like, yeah. Oh, absolutely. We'll go 100. Totally. Yeah. What's up?
I'm going to piggyback off of what Dave said in a way that might surprise Dave. And that I'm not going to talk about the AI, but about the imperative. And this is less a question as well, so forgive me my presumptions, but we're at a point where we're at a crossroads in terms of what social behavior is sort of, the palette that social behaviors and social systems are giving us.
Mm-hmm.
On the one hand, inclusivity is a thing, right? And we all want to be able to be more open and inclusive and all of that kind of stuff. But we've also rarely been in a time when we've been willing to sort of micro-categorize in the ways that we have as a means of redistributing power, really about claiming power, right? So we don't want to be monoliths anymore.
Mm-hmm.
We want to be these small subgroups of people that can identify very specifically along different categories in order to be able to revel in the power that that gives you, to be able to claim your own identity, etc. That's a really weird position to be in when the job before has been assume monoliths, assume that society is going molding people into these sort of silos and categories, and then just market to them because that's where everybody's going.
Right.
Well, we're going in the other way, right? It's this weird diaspora of identity, which has been awesome for a lot of things, but makes it really hard to get these big personal lumps, aggregations, and stuff like that. At a point where we're actually told, yeah, but all of these individuals, these wild individuals, are all supposed to be in the same big club, right? And we're supposed to find commonality across those differences and stuff like that. So it's not just a question of what the moral imperative is and whether or not we need to feed the AI and whatever. It's about somebody's got to lead the effort to navigate this sort of wild water and figure out how do you talk to people that do have something in common when you can't count on the things that you used to be able to count on to derive those commonalities. And I can't think of a better bunch of people, a better industry to sort of be doing that than content strategists.
Absolutely. And I think one of the other burgeoning behaviors from that is it used to be everyone wanted to be king of the hill, right? And it was you saw the big hill and you wanted to be on top of it. I can't. The new behavior is well, I'll just make a new hill. Why would that one exist? What would I do with it? And so we have kings and queens of many hills, and we have people who don't want to be on a hill at all. And so I think that's a really cool extension of that too. And yeah.
No.
Oh, okay. Yes.
Well, is it a little bit about moving away from kind of demographic focused personas and moving towards things that are more behavioral?
Yeah.
And also not making the assumption that the behavior you're targeting is part of a whole persona, but that you're interacting with this person around this thing that they're interested in, and just building around that, rather than kind of taking that whole step back. And they're millennial moms and they're all their C-suite or whatever, but just it seems like if you can focus on what you actually know, they're here because they're interested in this thing, because the content that brought them here was focused on this thing, so we can assume these things about that aspect of that. Is that a better way to build this than to kind of take that, well, who is this person? You know, they make this much money and they live in this kind of house.
Yeah, and I think that's really true. And one of the reasons that it's often difficult to think about something like this and say like, okay, well, how do we practically apply this? Is because when we're thinking about that, like we're looking at a behavior and there's a million variables, and like content strategy is supposed to govern, like it's supposed to bring order to 1,000 variables. And the challenge is in front of us, not behind us. And so the solution is also in front of us and not behind us. And so when I thought about like, okay, how do we conclude this rather lofty and theoretical talk about what is identity, how can content strategists get a better idea of how to learn about identity, the solution has not yet arrived. So the conclusion is to ask you the question. Is to further a conversation, because conversation and exchange is learning. Like conversation and exchange is progress. And so that's why I've selected to ask the question and to have you think about it, and reach out to me anytime. I'm always thinking about it. I'm also like part of my identity is, oh, sorry, it's your precious. Okay. Part of my identity is also like, I totally like lose my mind when somebody is like, hey, do you want to get coffee and talk about like literally anything? I'm like, oh my God, yes. So anytime, like, or if you're like, I'm going to go to the pet store and then like, I'm in, I'm always in. I love being a part of people's like ordinary life. But if you're thinking about this and you want somebody to talk to, I will always be talking about this. I also, the survey, if any of you opened it and looked at it, thank you for completing it. I am continuing the work on that, and I'll be developing some content really shortly. And that is really more specific to explorations about gender and about racial identity and sexual orientation. And so if you have any interest in having those conversations, I'm always down for those as well. But I just wanted to say thanks, and I hope that you guys had a ton of conversations today, and you learned a little bit more about your own identities, how to get to know somebody else. And just to close out, the next time you go to a party and you meet somebody new, and you can't think of a question that isn't, hey, who are you? What do you do? This is my icebreaker. In a zombie apocalypse, right? What is your role in like the survival tribe? Like, what are you, a governor? Like, are you a person who tries to like put order back into the world? Are you like a cultivator? Do you try to grow food? I personally think I would be like the scavenger. Like I'd go out and like get stuff and bring it back. So you can ask people that, and their responses are amazing. And if they're really into the zombie apocalypse, the next thing you can ask them is like, what would be your selected weapon? So,
what's a good meeting spot? I actually have mine picked.
Okay, what's up?
It's that weird billboard on like race, like second in race, that looks like a crazy UFO. It's like a triangle billboard with the sky on it. Like it's almost never has a real billboard on it, but it's just three of them, and it looks like a really weird thing. And there's a thing that you can scamper up and get up there. So, yeah.
I like your choice of verbs. I like your meeting location. Cool.
You have to cut their heads off. You can't shoot them. You gotta cut their heads off. So mine's machete.
Machete?
Yeah, machete.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah. But I don't know what I would be in the zombie apocalypse, so I'm gonna think about it.
Yeah, think about it. Who are you? Yeah. So like
add as a comment to our
yeah. Yeah.
I think that would actually be a great thing to circle back.
When I do like brand archetypes or sometimes user profiles, I try not to use the same set of like characters. So sometimes I've written like website briefs where the users are broken down by like Harry Potter houses. Sometimes I do it by like traditional literary archetypes. So like, are they the seeker? Are they like the magician? Sometimes I do it by, I actually asked on Twitter, I was teaching a panel at the Women's Business Development Center yesterday, and I crowdsourced, I said like, what do you want to share with people? and a gal said that she does some of her archetype. Is that you? Oh my God! This was the best. I thought this was so cool. It's so nice to meet you. She does her archetypes and like her like categories by tarot cards, which is like so cool. I mean, there's a million ways to think about how people like relate to different stories and environments. So I thought that was really neat. Yeah, cool. Well, that's it.
Thank you.
Thank you.